Hi, I'm Colin Morgan, executive producer of Built to Sell Radio. And if you've been enjoying this podcast, you're going to absolutely love our new newsletter, Built to Sell News. We share actionable tips and insights to help you get inside the mind of an acquirer and punch above your weight when it comes time to exit. To subscribe, simply head over to builttosell.com/subscribe to sign up for free today.
Ben Landers, welcome to Built to Sell Radio.
Thanks for having me, John. Great to be here.
Tell me the founder story behind this company, Blue Corona.
Yeah, I'll give you the short version. I started my career working for, bigger companies, hotjobs.com, then WorldCom. Older listeners might know how some of those worked out. Not great.
Yeah.
And then I pivoted over to the small business world. And ultimately, I found myself working for an entrepreneur who really, I went to work for him as like a mentor. His name is Bob Perini. And he was running a company called Drink More Water, bottled water delivery company, homes and offices in and around the DC area, which is where I lived at the time. And anyway, I met Bob through, I think, mountain biking and a mutual business kind of connection. And I really went to work for Bob. I had no intention of going to work for the bottled water company, but I went to work for Bob because Bob was sort of your classic entrepreneur where a bunch of people that had worked for him had left to start their own companies, of which Bob was an investor and owner advisor. And I was like, you know what, I don't have any money. My parents don't have any money. And I was a sales and marketing, my background was sales and marketing and didn't have an operations background or, finance or anything. And so I needed someone who could advise me in that regard anyway. So I went to work for Bob, and then through working for Bob, we'd started a couple businesses. We started an office coffee business. And I was sort of running the office coffee business. It was within his Drink More Water business. And I was doing a coffee demo for a plumbing company, residential plumbing company that I thought was huge. It was probably a $10, $15 million residential plumbing company. And I'm sitting here demoing the Keurig coffee machine. So I'm supposed to be focused on like selling this coffee machine to this guy and his staff. And I started asking about marketing. I said, you guys are running full page color ads in the yellow pages. Like, what kind of sense could that possibly make? And he says, well, why would you say that? And I said, well, I have an ownership interest in Drink More. I didn't really. Bob told me to kind of talk that way. And I do all the advertising marketing, and we've cut all our yellow page advertising to just bold listing. And this was probably back in 2004, 2005. And he said, that's ridiculous. Why would you have done that? And I said, well, we built a system to track all the advertising, so we can see exactly which marketing channels are bringing in the best, leads, sales. We got the ROI. And he calls over his head of marketing and he says, tell her what you just told me. And I sort of explained to her how we were tracking everything. And we had built this janky, ad tracking platform. And I remember coming back to Bob sort of saying, I don't want to run the coffee business. Like we need to start a new company, doing this. Because that had no geographic limitations, obviously a much bigger total addressable market. And anyway, this is my version of the story. I'm sure Bob will listen to this and say, he has a completely different version, which is fine. But anyway, that's how it started. But Bob is, no one has changed my life more besides my parents and my wife and kids. No one has had a more positive impact on my life than Bob.
And what was it? What was his reaction to this idea of a marketing services business?
Well, so he loved it. I mean, Bob is Mr. Data and Analytics. Like Bob, when I met Bob, I was, had an advertising background. I loved, marketing and advertising and sales. And I was pushing Bob to, sponsor cycling teams and, do all sorts of stuff. And Bob was like, he hated, in a way, advertising marketing because of all the fluff. Right, the yellow page rep would come in each year and say, your competitor's doing this, you need to spend more. Look at what McDonald's and Nike do. You're a little business. If you want to be a big business, you need to invest X% of your revenue in marketing and advertising. And if it doesn't work, they tell you, well, you just didn't spend enough, right? Or your messaging was wrong or whatever. Bob was a engineer from Duke, and then he went to Harvard and got an MBA. And he was really a finance guy, numbers guy, engineer. So Bob wanted to quantify anything and everything in his business and when it came to advertising marketing. So to tell him, like, we should have a business where we're, using data to help small business owners see what's working, what's not, that's like 100%. He's all about that.
So Bob's an engineer. He's a finance guy. He understands numbers. How did you figure out the equity split with Bob? I mean, did he put the money in and you get the sweat equity, or did you each kind of kick in cash, or how did you divvy up the equity?
that was a big issue from my standpoint. So Bob had a playbook for how he would launch these companies. And this is, again, my vantage point. He might have a different view. But what Bob would do was he would, someone working for him, entrepreneurial person, or he would have an idea. And then you kind of think, who is going to run this? Who's going to own this thing? And so he would incubate, the company within Drink More Water. And so, you'd be sort of doing the services like with the coffee company. We were running the coffee company and delivering coffee and charging people for coffee, but it was all coming from Drink More Water. And the idea was that at some point it gets big enough that you'd split it out into a separate entity and sort of recapitalize it. And the person running, let's just use the coffee business, running it would get some shares, call it, 1 to 20% or something. And Bob would have the majority, A, because he would put the cash in, and B, because you would have been getting paid by Drinkmore, getting benefits from Drinkmore. And technically, when you work for a company, you have this duty of loyalty to the company. Any idea that you come up with is the company's intellectual property, not yours. This is as I understand it. And so with Blue Corona, I was sort of, when we launched that company, we sort of launched it. Our first sale was to his high school buddy. And again, we had no company set up. So he was paying us, but as I remember it, he was like covering the Google. It's kind of a longer story. We're doing the tracking for free, and we were managing this realtor's Google ad spend. And we used the customer's credit card for the ads, and then the fee. I don't even know that I was charging a fee. It was like a theoretical. And anyway, the point is you're sort of doing all this stuff. And then Bob, is kind of a genius if you're the entrepreneur, if you're Bob, which is you get some young guy, me at the time, I think I was, this was in 2007 that we really kind of were starting Blue Corona. And so I would have been like 30. And you get the entrepreneur, the person doing the sweat kind of, in it. And then you sit down and have the equity conversation. So when we first sat down, it probably went something like this. Bob probably said, how much equity do you think you deserve or should get? He put in all the money. As I remember, I didn't put in any hard dollars. And I probably said it 50%, right? Like it's our idea. Like, I came up with a lot of the ideas, you shaped it, and he was like, well, don't you think that's kind of ridiculous?
So Bob's saying it's kind of crazy that you're looking for half the equity here. You're an employee. I paid you well, and I've incubated you. Like, how did it go from there? Like, what was your reaction, and how did you guys come to some?
Yeah, it was not. I mean, my reaction was. I mean, it was tough. It was a tough. One of the challenges, and I'm sure a lot of the entrepreneurs listening to this, might, relate to this is. I was the young, sort of sweat entrepreneur. Bob was like I was the sheep and Bob was the wolf, right? He lived 3 of my lifetimes in a sense in business. And so I remember calling my cousin who's an attorney and just saying, hey, this is the situation, what should I do? And he was like, you should kind of flip and sort of like reinforce the mentor mentee. Like, you're my sort of business idol, and whatever equity you can get, you should be thankful for, because you really are entitled to nothing. And this is like my own cousin, saying this stuff, and I'm like, you kidding me? And then I went and I was a competitive cyclist at the time, so I was like an elite cyclist, and how sports works. If you're good at something, everyone likes you. And so some of the older guys, I was a 30-year-old super fast guy, and some of the older slow guys were, business guys or had a lot of money. So I met with a couple of those, while I'm sort of negotiating with Bob. I'm like after work going to meeting with like the wealthy lawyer friend that I have and saying, hey, what should I do? And that guy's saying like, hey, me and my buddies will back you. We'll give you $1 million right now. Screw Bob. But the reality was I believed that, and I still believe this, that I needed Bob. I mean, I didn't understand, finance, operations, organizational design. I didn't understand any of that. I was a first-time entrepreneur, and so it was sort of like, gosh, I actually don't want just hard money or like silent partners. I actually need someone to guide me. And later in my career, I joined Vistage and then YPO. But back then, I had no business, so there's no getting into YPO with no company. Essentially, it got very contentious with Bob and I. I think he would agree on this. He was incredulous. I was like an ingrate. Multiple times we were yelling so loudly in his conference room that people like came in and said like, is everything okay in here? Bob is similar to me. I'm a very happy guy, but I'm super passionate and I'm very competitive. And so I can get worked up at the drop of a hat. Bob is an Italian. Bob Perini is like an Italian guy. You picture like an Italian, like Godfather dinner, right? With the Don and like Sonny. That was me. So, I said some things that I, in retrospect, probably regret saying, like, how, this is like unfair and all that stuff. And so ultimately what we wound up with was 47.5% Ben, 47.5% Bob, 5% Alex, where Alex was Bob's daughter. And then our bylaws, I required that the bylaws required supermajority voting for all decisions. So it's basically Bob and Ben have to agree. And I thought such a victory, right? I'm like 47.5%. He can't fire me. My fear was he has multiple kids that are extremely smart. Alex was our first employee. Hiring her was my idea. So in retrospect, I'm like, damn it, like should have hired someone that wasn't related to either of us. But yeah, she was super smart. She had just graduated from UNC Chapel Hill, and I knew her pretty well. And I thought like she would be perfect. She's kind of like me. She can do a lot of different things, pretty well, even though she would have been right out of school. And so, but I was, of course, concerned that I would build this company up and then he would like fire me and have all his kids, take it over.
Sure.
Anyway, I thought it was a big win. What I didn't appreciate and what ultimately led to a lot of friction down the road was I could veto Bob, but Bob could veto me. I worked in the business. Bob did not. So, I want the fancy office in a downtown area where it's cool place to attract and retain talent. Bob's like, we're not doing that. I had 3 people in my office when we were acquired, 3 people sharing my office because we were just busting at the seams. And Bob was like, I'm not signing on to a multi-million-dollar multi-year lease. Now, that was in 2020. That was in 2020 that I had this multi-million-dollar lease on the table. So in retrospect, it was fantastic that he put the kibosh on that, because then COVID hit and we went totally remote. We never came back.
Right. Of course. We were the same in our company. We had a lease coming up for renewal. We were out touring around office space and we were all told, the NBA ended, it like canceled the rest of the season. We're like, maybe we should hold off on that lease. Sounds similar to
but it was extremely contentious. And I don't know how someone with a broader vocabulary of like negotiating terms and who's able to like keep themselves calm under pressure probably could have found a way. When we got through that negotiation, in one sense, things were never the same. Our relationship was always more contentious, afterwards. And that's with a business that was doing incredibly well. Imagine if things had not gone well.
Yeah.
Would have been bad.
Yeah. Just for my edification, when you say a super majority for major decisions, like what would constitute a major decision, and how would you know it was a decision that you would have to go to Bob for?
That was a misstatement. That's what I wish the agreement said. The original agreement was all, I don't remember how it was written. It's like legalese, kind of your standard. We were an S corporation, and so we had bylaws and articles of incorporation. And I think the bylaws said something like all operating decisions. And so in the early years when we were brand new, we had very little money. I was ordering stationery, right, with our name, like letterhead, and it was like $5,000. And I sent him a note and said, "Hey, I'm about to pull the trigger on this. Like, are you cool with this?" And he was like, "I'm in Italy, like, riding my bike. Like, why are you bothering me on this? You're the owner of the company. You're the CEO. Like, it's $5,000. I'm like, okay. I didn't know. The way it worked practically was in the beginning, I was getting his approval for almost every expenditure. As soon as the company, we started making money, the company started growing, I basically kind of said to him, "Look, I'm just going to go. I'm just going to do things. But like if I'm hiring, like a new person," this is when we had like no employees. So if I'm hiring a person, I'll kind of send you a note and make sure you're cool with it. If I, any purchase over $5,000, I'll send you a note, that kind of thing. And then of course those limits, by the time, like flash forward in 2000, so we started the company officially, the company was incorporated in early 2008. By 2010, 11, I was going to Bob when we would have like, a senior person leaves, he was serving as like a Vistage chair or like a YPO forum person, right? Where he's like, I'm like, "Man, I got a big problem. Our biggest client just gave notice. Shit, what should I do?" Or employee, we're doing discretionary bonuses, and this is sort of how I'm thinking about divvying the pie up. What do you think? That type of thing.
And were you going to Bob in those days in 2012 as a courtesy in recognition of his ownership stake, or because you still thought of him as a mentor?
Both. He is like, again, one of the smartest guys that I've ever met. Certainly in like the small business world. I mean, he's extremely bright. And there was, and we had another moment later down the road where we had another big fight where he essentially said, like, "I'm done being your, sort of your blankie to fall back on. Like, you put on your big boy pants, like you're going to make these."
What was the fight over?
I think it was, I wanted our office. So again, I'll keep this short. We had bought a building in a light industrial area in Gaithersburg, Maryland, before starting Blue Corona. So when we started the company, we had a whole downstairs of this 2-story building that was available. And so Bob's thing was like, let's keep the overhead super low. You can move downstairs and kind of use this space. And we were also subletting out part of that space. So he's like, as you grow, we'll kick out the subtenant. But when you think about, we were running a digital marketing software company. So where are those offices and what do they look like, right? They're in like downtown Baltimore, like Bethesda, Maryland, Georgetown. Some are cool. Arlington, overlooking, something nice where you can walk down to lunch. You're asking people to work crazy hours. Well, I had people walking to the BP gas station for lunch. Like I had people come to interview and they're like out front going like, "All I see is this water factory. Like, where are you?" So for me, I had all my key employees I had some employees that more than money. Now, they were young and naive, but more than money, they wanted an office where they didn't have to drive an hour. They all lived in the city. And so I think I said some things to him like, we need this and you're being cheap. And he owns and owned the majority of the building. I had like a 2%, stake in the building. So, I probably said some stuff like, "You're way overcharging us for rent. And of course you are, because you're the big owner of the building." And he probably heard that and said, you piece of ass, like how, so ungrateful, all the things I've done for you.
Almost sounds like
we were like an old married couple.
Or even like a father-son relationship where the son finally kind of wants his own.
Yeah. And the one thing that's funny is we both had other partners in things since. And one day I had a call with him and I just said, man, it's like I owe you a big apology because, I've had now this incident with this other guy and like, so I would, you were the best partner like I could have ever had. And he's like, I never thought I'd say this, but I think the same thing about you.
Really?
Yeah. And I love that Munger quote, the best way, to attract a great partner is to deserve one. And I think the two of us, for all of our faults, I think we, I always tried to do right by him, even if he didn't always see it that way. And I think vice versa. He was always trying to help me get out of my own way.
So let's talk about the business model. In the early days, you're one of the leaders, I guess, in quantitative analytics-based marketing for small businesses. So instead of just, Yellow Pages ads where you never knew where the ROI was, you were starting to become much more scientific about marketing. I understand at one point you decided to focus on home services as a vertical.
Yeah.
HVAC, plumbing, garage door, et cetera. Maybe walk me through that strategic decision. What made you decide to verticalize?
Yeah. Well, so what's funny about it was not strategic. When we started the business, well, first of all, the original idea was just to track advertising. We were actually not going to do any advertising marketing. We were going to be this sort of independent, tracker of all the different advertising marketing. But what happened was I had another plumbing company as a client, early client, where we tracked all their Yellow Page ads. And I showed the owner that like you're basically throwing away $60,000 a month. I mean, this was a big company, big plumbing company. Yellow Page advertising was at its peak, or kind of at the end now. And so he cancels it. And he says, look, I love you. I mean, like, I can't believe this. It's like incredible what you've done and what you've helped us do. But I'm trying to grow the business. So what do I do? Like, you're tracking all this stuff. What actually works? And I remember looking at his website. It was like an 8-page, brochure site. And I said, I was like, when's the last time you rebuilt the website? Like, do you do SEO? You ever heard of pay-per-click? He thought pay-per-click. He thought I was saying pay-per-click marketing. So like months went by and he's like, I've been asking every business owner I know and no one does this pay-per-click, advertising. I was like, oh shit, that's because it's not called that, but whatever, we'll get there. But so I remember coming back to Bob and saying, my background originally, Bob was the real analytical guy, not me. He had to sort of twist my arms to track things. And a lot of the tracking that we did back then was somewhat manual, and I hated it. I mean, I hated the business of it, like tagging phone calls, lead solicitation, et cetera. So, but anyway, that's how we got from tracking purely analytics to advertising, digital marketing, and analytics. And then the tracking became our differentiator. Like when we tell you that Google pay-per-click, almost said pay-per-click, generated 50 leads at this cost per lead and this many sales and this many sales dollars, it's 100% accurate. We're not calling a lead like a phone call that is generated. There was actually another advertising person trying to sell you more advertising and using Google as their prospecting tool. So that was the first pivot, was from just analytics to advertising and marketing with this analytics differentiator. And then to your question about the home services, our original clients, first I went after all the bottled water companies. So my original case study, I did a case study of Drink More Water, and I sent it to like 100, 200, 300 bottled water companies. But bottled water companies were having a really tough time because the 2008 recession, people were cutting all discretionary spending, offices especially, and two, the whole plastic, BPA and all that stuff. So then I remember thinking back to the plumbing company where I did the coffee demo, going like, who else does a lot of Yellow Page advertising? It's like plumbers, electricians, roofers, home services. So that's when we went after, I got 3 or 4 plumbing clients, including Len the Plumber, which Len the Plumber today is plus residential plumbing company. When we started working them, $1, and outside of Baltimore, no one knew who Len the Plumber was. So I liked home service companies for a couple different reasons. One, I knew the space. I mean, I spent so much time at Drinkmore, kind of talking to those folks. When your office is in a light industrial area, that's who. When you go to the burrito place down the road, it's all the workers and owners of those companies that are out there, which are a lot of the home service companies. So those were like my people, in a sense. The other thing that I loved was when I would go to digital marketing conferences, and I've written about this before, you'd have all these hoity-toity advertising people like, oh, we have Porsche as our client, or we have Four Seasons International. And then I remember being in a group of people and someone introduced me and they're like, this is my friend Ben. He builds websites for plumbers. And everyone like kind of laughed, just like you're laughing. But I remember the problem with their business in general, serving these huge companies, these huge clients, is to do a pitch for Porsche, you're spending like 20 or 30 grand, like to do the pitch. And it requires like super hoity-toity, advertising marketing people, like kind of like famous industry people to do the pitch. And you're pitching against, these other huge advertising companies. And so, it's like with Len the plumber, we might have been the only one competing for that piece of business. And the owner, like, you didn't have any committees. Like the owner would see the data and would be like, cancel all that stuff. I want to test whatever Ben's saying to test. So I loved it. And our average client back then was probably $1,700 a month. They were probably spending with us versus the guy who has Porsche or gal has Porsche as a client, they might be spending, 50 grand a month. But, if I lost, once we built up enough scale, if I lost a couple clients, I mean, it always hurt. But it was like, I'm not going to have to reduce headcount because I lost one client. And so it made for a much more predictable, scalable business. Again, when I met Bob, I had an advertising and marketing background and I was super passionate. I still am passionate about digital marketing, but I would have run the coffee company. I'm more passionate about the game of business than like the type of business. I used to joke around with the HVAC clients that our businesses are like identical. Like I could run your HVAC company, I think, and I think you could run my digital marketing company because the people component is such a big, I didn't have trucks and inventory. That would have been a little hard for me to adapt to, but whatever.
How did you handle the competition factor where if you were working with Len the plumber and you were a specialist in helping plumbers generate demand and marketing, and there's a second plumber, did you tell Len, hey, I'm working with a second plumber just to let you know? And how did you stick him?
Yeah. That was like a many sleepless nights, but only for me. No one else thought of it as. It's amazing how your internal dialogue, shapes so much of how you think and feel when other people do not feel that way at all. So when it first started coming up, we would do sort of like we're not going to solicit, competitors. And if we get a solicitation, we'll tell you. I mean, when we were really small, right? So if we were working with Magnolia Plumbing, that was a big DC outfit, and we got a call in from, fill in the blank. So like their biggest competitor, I might call up Joe Magnolia and say, hey, we just got this inquiry. How do you want me to handle it? Interestingly, Joe, that did come up with Joe, and he was like, go for it. Like, help them. Like, it's not us versus them. There are a million companies out there. I don't know if we've ever even run into that. So there were some business owners who had this very much like they were in industry groups and they would share stuff, even with, people that were arguably competitors. And then there were others that were like, no way. Like we had a roofing company where I became kind of buddies with the owner, and we got an inbound inquiry from like his biggest competitor. And I said, hey, I just got this inquiry, what do you think? And he was like, I would think you shouldn't respond to that. Like you're my guy. So when we were small, we sort of navigated, I would say, case by case. We didn't put exclusivity in, agreements. As we got bigger, we got some bigger deals where people would start requesting it, right? And so someone in the middle of nowhere to us, like middle of nowhere, Tennessee, would say, hey, I want exclusivity 30 miles around my office. And back then when we were small, it was like, okay, like write it in there, right? Then we started getting a little bit more sophisticated where it was like, wait a second, like how are we going to work this when company A acquires company B and company B is now in an area where we had some exclusive. Like, what are we going to do? So then we started going through kind of the concept of, look, like our policy became like, A, we're the best at what we do. So if you want to hire the best, you hire us and we'll put you with a different team, kind of set up the Chinese curtains. We're not going to share your data. We're, and again, you're positioned differently in the marketplace, which is usually true. Like we had one HVAC company around here, and again, sort of mid to early on, we got a call from a close competitor. I tell the owner who I was kind of buddies with, and he goes, "Those guys crawl, dig around in crawl spaces. We would never do some of the crap that they would do. So go ahead and take that one." But again, as the business grew, the company, the corporate philosophy essentially became, we're not doing exclusives. We're the best. You want to hire the best, hire us. And if you want someone who's exclusive, to you, like how good are they kind of really going to be? And then you didn't ask this, but I'll mention it anyway, which is we, when we were acquired, we did have to go through like every single agreement and sort of pick out and say, hey, we do still have fill in the blank 5 clients, with an exclusivity clause, and here's what it is, and here's what it, prevents us, from doing, type of thing.
How did that impact the conversations you were having with the acquirer?
It's zero, because there were so few. We got lucky. We got lucky in a number of fronts. I mean, I really thought that we were going to have to be exclusive. I mean, we had a couple competitors, and that was their lead. And I thought, as someone who obviously spent the beginning of our life selling our services, I was like, I'll never be able to combat that. Like, if I say that, like, I can close any of those deals. I mean, without question. But again, it kind of but one of the things that Bob used to do, and this is like obviously brilliant from a mentor standpoint, is, is he would just say, like, I question that assumption. Like, you think everyone out there thinks the way you do. You think everyone out there is going to care. And I'm telling you, they don't. And I thought he was just saying that because, like, obviously from an economic standpoint, it'd be much better if we didn't have, sort of these constraints. But, I remember when I hired a VP of sales and marketing, a guy who had a lot of experience, ended up becoming the president of Blue Corona. And now he's the CEO of the company who acquired us. But I remember bringing him in, saying, like, him asking that question, saying, this is how we handle it. We just don't do it. And he was like, okay. I was like, geez. So don't, I guess what I learned, I still do it a lot, obviously, which is just, making a lot of assumptions about how people are going to feel, that they're going to think the same way I think, and they don't.
Yeah, it's a good lesson for sure. How did you handle the private equity kind of noise that was, I'm sure, disrupting a lot of your clients? Most of the businesses that you work with, these HVAC and plumbing companies, are being targeted, in many cases rolled up by private equity groups. How did that impact your business?
It in a way, it reminded me early on, we made a strategic decision not to go after franchises or franchisees, or I guess either. We didn't go after either, because typically the franchisee had all these restrictions. So like they couldn't track the way we wanted to track because corporate had them on some, CRM or something that we couldn't tap into. And we never wanted to go after the franchisors because we thought they were too big of a pain to deal with, and that they wanted cookie cutter, like they want a $500 SEO package that they can just drop in. And, we're not the bespoke, Porsche ad agency, but we're not like the Yellow Page, like, drop in SEO thing. We using competitive analysis, we started to figure out that franchisees, franchisors are super valuable to kind of add on to our business. So we did start going that way. And then going back to your question about the private equity, it was similar from the standpoint that, early on when we'd have a client that was acquired by private equity, they would come in, it would be this sort of meeting where, the Blue Card account manager would get told, I want you to walk us through everything you're doing for us and the results year to date. And it would be like, some random date, like May 10th. And then there would be a new person on the call, usually some kid in a sport coat. And it's like, what is this? And then it would come out later that, hey, this company's acquired us and they have a relationship with fill in the blank, bigger, marketing company, and we're switching everything to them. And so at first, it was like, oh, this is bad. Like when private equity comes in and rolls up companies, bad for Blue Corona, what we thought. But then later, again, we had some internal meetings where it was like, okay, like, how do we play this? And one of the things we started doing is when those calls were happening, we would do like a full, like put lots of resources, like we didn't call it a tiger team, but like a little team of people where we would present this, like what we're doing for that company in a way that like we knew kind of an MBA type would go like, this is amazing. It's like ridiculous. We would show the data and really emphasize kind of the apples and oranges element to the data. And we did that in a bunch of instances. And all of a sudden the tide started changing where the private equity company would say, okay, we're going to let this company keep Blue Corona. And we're going to see how it goes versus our other accounts. And we'd like put our best people on those deals. And then all of a sudden we started getting the whole platform, the whole deal, like all their brands. And I obviously don't keep in touch closely. And the Blue Corona folks, this company's now been rebranded, but wouldn't give me all the details. But, by the time we were, in 2019, 2018, the roll up of the home services world started really pre-COVID from my standpoint. We were suddenly seeing those as like a really strategic kind of growth channel for us, and starting to, we started really seeing like, wow, the data is really like our super competitive advantage, the results in the data and the reporting.
Especially with private equity.
It's ridiculous. Yeah, because you're talking to someone who the language of numbers and accounting and ROI, they love that stuff.
How big did you get Blue Corona before you decided to sell?
Well, what's funny about that is that when I met Bob, very early on, I mean, we used to have lots of long conversations at like 4 or 5 in the morning about like life. And one of his comments was like, well, what's your number? And I was like, what do you mean? What number, if you had it in the bank, you just do nothing, ride your bike, hang out, travel. And, I think for me at the time, it was probably $5 million. And he said his number, I think, was 10. And I remember anytime, even before we started the coffee company, the idea was like, he told me when he started Drink More that he had this model where he was going to start these stores and each store was going to do $1 million in revenue and he'd get 10 of them. And then Deer Park, owned by Nestle, would come along and buy them. And, he'd have his money. And so we started Blue Corona with the intention of selling. It was built to sell. I know all the books say, never start a company with the exit in mind. But, I think I listened to your book on Audible. I looked it up. My birthday, 2014, was when I first listened to your book. And so we were already doing a lot of that, and that sort of just accelerated. But I say all that in that we almost were sold to a client as best I can remember, it was probably 2013 or 14. And that fell apart in the 11th hour, really over my compensation. And I'll get into that. Maybe that's a different story. But, and so the idea was I wanted to get the company into a certain size where I could have sort of my number. And I was always thinking that way. And later when I hired that guy, his name's Mike Wilson, I hired a guy as vice president of sales and marketing. And I remember Mike at various points saying like, we're doing so well. Like, why would you, want to step off, even if you could get that. But I'm a worrier by nature. I mean, I think, I obviously, dream big and think I'm an optimistic person. But I was always, losing sleep over like Blue Corona could just fall apart tomorrow if Amazon gets into lead gen or, Google decides to, change the game and do direct connect. And so I just felt like, all my eggs are in this one basket. And so when people started calling, in 2017, I got an acceleration calls mostly from search funds. I didn't know what a search fund was. And Bob sort of encouraged me, why don't you just take the calls and just like, you'll learn, what people are looking for. And so I learned the whole search model and how that works and the multiples. And
explain the search model for folks who maybe haven't gone through that.
Yeah, I mean, it as I understand it, or as I would explain, it's a small private equity fund. So a group of people put money in a bucket. MBA, coming out of it originated at the top business schools. But some MBA coming out of Harvard says, I want to run a company, but through acquisition. But hey, I don't have any money, because I'm a kid. But the person's obviously very smart, and so the group of investors backs the searcher. Usually the searcher's paid like $125 a year, and for 2 years they just do nothing but look for a business to buy. When they find one that might work, they present it back to their group of investors, and investors might say, "Yeah, that sounds great. Here's the money." Or and in one sense, it's kind of like the Bob and Ben show, right? Then the searcher might have couple percent, 5%, and they might be able to earn more equity based on growth targets and that kind of thing. So that's how the search model works. And what I joking would say to those folks is, why in the world would you want to buy this business? It's a pain in the ass to run. You don't know anything about, advertising, marketing, small businesses. You're crazy. And number two, I know you don't really have like a check for $20 million there. You got to take all this and go pitch it to some guys. A bunch of them are like doctors. They're probably a bunch of cheapskates. And the multiples that you guys pay for businesses, in order for your model to work, you got to pay a multiple that no one in my shoes is ever going to sell for, 5, 4 to 6 times, EBITDA multiple. So it's like you're barking up the wrong tree.
How did they react to that?
I mean, no, I didn't say it quite that way. So, I became friendly with a bunch of them. It's kind of funny. One of our clients got purchased. And shortly after he got purchased, the guy emails me and he's like, and I told the guy was calling me to buy Blue Corona. And I told him he should go buy a home service company. And he calls me. He's like, Ben, like, it's me, Dan, like, remember me? It's like, I bought this company that turns out that they were using you. So. Yeah, I'm still friendly with a lot of those guys. And I've invested in a search fund, incidentally, these days.
Interesting. So you're rebuffing these conversations with the search firms. You mentioned 4 to 5 times EBITDA. Like, did you have a sense of what you hoped the business would attract at this stage before selling? I mean, as you're building it, you're having 2017, you're having these conversations. Are you thinking in terms of a multiple of EBITDA? And if so, what are you starting to formulate?
So what had been told to me, I made it a point, when I finally got the business to where I had like an executive team running the company, and I would say I was only at that point was I functioning like truly as a CEO, where I was sort of more outward focused in terms of like, innovation and like strategic partners and all that kind of stuff. I started reaching out to investment bankers and essentially saying, hey, look, got this business, it's a great business. We might be looking to grow through acquisition. And so what do firms like we might want to acquire, what do they trade for? And this would have been in like 2019, 2018, sometime around then. And what I essentially heard was, I'd get an investment banker and they'd I always kind of felt like kind of put in my place by those guys, like, I'm really sophisticated, you're kind of dumb. And businesses like yours, trade, for like 6 to 7 times EBITDA max. If you have software that's like a SaaS type add-on, then maybe, 7 to 9. And I would say things like, I was friendly with a lot of CEOs in our space, and I would say, I know someone who sold their business and they told me they got, 10, 11 times EBITDA. And I remember one investment banker in particular saying like, that's bullshit. And deals get done at 7 times. No deals do not get done in your space. Like if you actually want to sell, this is how you need to be thinking. If you actually want to acquire a company, this is where your numbers need to be. The interesting thing, and you probably know this better than anyone, but maybe for the audience's benefit, and one thing I would caution, folks about, and again, I sort of learned it a little bit, which is, if people throw out these numbers, like I got a 15 times multiple. Well, 15 times what, right? So was it trailing 12-month EBITDA? Was it your projected EBITDA. It's April and you're projecting out through the end of the year. Did you get a multiple of that? In terms of the adjustments that you made, were there any adjustments that they, sort of accepted, or did you adjust it where the number doubled? So I ended up meeting people over the years, either through YPO or other, organizations where, I would kind of learn that the 15x EBITDA and like the 10x EBITDA are a little bit closer than both parties would have you sort of believe. Or someone would sell and they'd say, oh, I got 15 times EBITDA, but they only got half in cash, and then the rest was in a lengthy earnout. And if I follow up today and say, how much of that earnout did you actually get? I wouldn't even ask, because I kind of feel like I might know the story. So in my mind, I wanted a number from the business. It's stupid, just a number in my head I had. And I was focused more throughout the whole thing, both as we were thinking about selling, we were solicited. We weren't out pitching the business per se. But at one level, I didn't even care. Like, I only cared to make sure that whatever multiple I was calculating, like, okay, if we do it on like projected EBITDA and everything comes to fruition, our multiple would be this. And if we do it on like averaged last 3 years EBITDA, because our EBITDA was going up so quickly, it would be this. And like, does all of that fit within a range of like, is it reasonable? By any measure, thought what we were being offered was, was rich. But I'm sure if I'm the acquirer, if I put on my private equity hat and I look at how I know the business is, done, at least through when we were acquired, it would be very easy to look at that and sort of say, this thing is like, just a little cash producing growth engine. And so sure, we'd be willing to pay a nice multiple for it.
So if I'm reading between the lines, and I know there's some confidentiality stuff that you can't get into, and I totally appreciate that. But at the time you're thinking, you're hearing 6 to 7, 7 is the kind of number, maybe with some software 9. There's some kind of fishing stories out there where the fish grows in size every time the story is retold, that you're hearing 10, 15. So in your mind, you're saying, okay, if we take a blended average of our historical EBITDA, which is growing, and we get maybe a low double digit number on that, well, that's pretty good. And
well, I mean, what I sort of did was I was very confident in our projections through 2021.
Okay.
So you take 2020 and say that's kind of an outlier for a million reasons. You look at 2019, you look at 2021, and you say, all right, if I take 2021 projected EBITDA and then I adjust it, like, I was not going to stay on other than some transition period. I mean, I told the person who solicited us, they said, what would your role need to be moving forward? I said, I'm living in my dream house. We're putting in a pool. It's not for sale. If you want to buy it, that number has got to be such that, like, I'm not sticking around, right? I'm out. That's the only, way that I would sell. And so I put that out there on the front end. And so I took our, EBITDA for 2021, added back, my salary and a bunch of stuff that I thought was like very reasonable, that any, investment banker would look at and go, okay, like they wouldn't need that. We wouldn't use that. Of course, they wouldn't have done that if they were, planning to sell. And then sort of gave all right, on the low end, I thought they operate like realtors. Like when the realtor says, you say, what's my house worth? The realtor wants to sell the thing. They don't want to be sitting on it. I don't remember whether it was Outliers or one of those books where, Malcolm Gladwell talks about how like realtors that sell their own house will sit on it forever to get.
Yeah. Freakonomics.
Yeah. Freakonomics.
Yeah.
And so I remember thinking like, all right, somewhere between this number and this number, is my range. And geez, even if we got the low end of that, I would get my number. And, do I really care? Like, the deal needs to get done. And then I also would tell potential acquirers, like, I would say no structure. Like, that it's got to happen at that number, no structure, no earnouts, no, wacky stuff. Now I said all that like, thumping my chest, but, in the reality was, there was obviously some, there were some elements of, structure, but not much.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And what was Bob's number?
I don't know. Bob is one of those guys that like, if I told him something like, you'd probably never share that with me again, then he would share it. But like if I asked him like, Bob, what's your number? Bob had since starting Blue Corona, Bob had multiple, he still had the water company, it was growing, it had the building, which was being paid off rapidly by the businesses. And who knows, other interests that he had, beyond my purview. So, and Bob is 18 years my senior. I'm now 48. So Bob was also, and he, he has he has good taste, but Bob lived in the same house that, he raised his kids in, nice house, but not like, it's not like he made some money and then went out and bought a mega mansion. He had a, modest house on a really nice piece of property with a pool and big backyard and stuff.
But how did he feel about the numbers the M&A bankers were throwing out, like 6 to 7, 7 to 9?
He wanted to sell. He was, I think, very irritated with me that the sale in 2013 or 14 didn't go through. And that would have been, I would have walked away from that. I would have had to put equity in the new go forward entity after taxes. I don't know how people do it I had to do it on post-tax dollars. So I would have walked from that with like $1 million in cash. And I don't remember what it was, 10 or 15% of the go forward. And so Bob would have had, more, but not, not too much more, because he wasn't going to put any in the go forward. And he was like super irritated that I didn't do it. And I remember thinking like, why do you, like, you must make so much money through the water company and our distributions. Like, why would you, need that? He was like, small businesses like almost never get sold. Like you might be blowing our like your one chance to take like real dollars off the table. But it was funny, when I was sitting down to negotiate with my, would-be boss, new partner, he gave me an employment contract, and like the salary I think was like $125 a year. And I said to him like, hey, or maybe it was $150. And I said, hey, I can't live on that. He says, well, that's 25 more than you make today. You make 125. I was like, yeah, but we distribute almost 100% of the profit of the company, and I own 47.5%. So I'm not making 125. I'm making like, so what's your policy on distribution? And he was going to do like a leveraged, he was going to borrow money, get SBA loan and some other stuff. He was going to do kind of a leverage deal where he was like, well, we need the cash flow. He said for growth, but I think he was probably meant to pay down the debt I'm going to stack on this thing. So so Bob, Bob also, a group of us bought shares from Bob in 2019. And I remember the guy that I hired said, hey, would you, I know you're not going to sell shares, but would Bob sell some shares? No. Bob will never sell shares. I thought it was, he doesn't want a minority interest, in the company. He wants, to have say. And so that guy was like, hey, well, let's take him out to dinner. I'm going to ask him. I was like, okay, but yeah, I'm telling you what he's going to say. And we take him out to dinner, and he floats that idea past Bob, and Bob's like, yeah, I'd consider it. I was like, son of a gun. You don't ask, you don't get. So a group of us bought shares from Bob in 2019.
How did you value the business for that?
Another painful decision. Bob was selling the shares. The company wasn't selling the shares. Bob was selling shares. So Bob came up with a 1x revenue multiple and said, hey, that's the valuation. It was like,
how did that equate to multiple EBITDA?
I don't know, but it would have bbeen high. It would have been rich. And of course, it was frustrating me. It was like, it's like, I don't know. It's this weird conundrum of like, that valuation is like propped up by me, and and
you put in all the sweat equity.
Yeah, but in retrospect, if you were to say, like, I was thinking like, I've listened to other episodes, what would you do then if you knew what you know now? It's like, I would have bought all of his shares myself, leveraged myself to the hilt to do it. But yeah, and in retrospect, buying shares, from him was like amazing decision for, those of us that did it. And just a great example of how, when you look at a company's, company that might, say a publicly traded company that's trading at some C multiple, and everyone says, well, yeah, but have to grow here to make that happen. Like in some instances, that and then some happens, and you wish you could have gotten it for the previous, price.
What was important to you, Ben, about hitting your number? Like you've mentioned a couple times this idea of like I had a number in mind. It wasn't necessarily that rational, but like, was it because you wanted to go buy something, or what did that number represent to you?
I have not met really anyone else like this, and I would love to meet someone like this. But when I listened to, I was in Vistage, which is a peer-to-peer CEO group. I was in YPO, sure. And I would hear these people that sell their business, and they would get like horribly depressed, and or they would say, I could never sell my business, I could never retire, like I'm too wired for doing stuff. And I was like, you're out of your mind. Like all I want to do is not have to work. Like that's all I want is 100% total independence over my time and have the finances to do that. Now, I would do this. I would get on a call and advise CEOs for free. I mean, it is fun, but I don't need to do it. I don't want to need to do it. So I wanted to get a number that I could live a certain lifestyle and never have to work again. The financial guys that I hired to manage half my stuff, the what is no shitty jobs. Like Ben doesn't ever want to have to work again, take a shitty job. So the motivation was really, I want complete independence. Hobbies, still a cyclist. I play bad golf, bad guitar, hiking. I've got a 17-year-old son and a 14-year-old daughter that, original vision was like, told my wife, I'm never going to be home. Like, what's your earliest memory? For me, it was like when I was 11 or 10. So I'm like, I really have the first 10 years of the kids' lives. They're not even going to remember that I wasn't here. And then I'll sell and I will be here all the time. I'll be like super dad. So anyway, so my concept was I want to sell and not have to do anything.
And to figure out that number, did you use the old 4% rule or a 3% rule, or was there some math that you did? Or
yes and no. I mean, I started tracking my monthly spend just randomly, maybe a couple years before we were really in talks with anyone about anything. And then I, sort of I heard about the 4% rule, but the problem, of course, was, like 2021, when we sold and I got a big lump sum of money, the interest rates were like 0. I mean, you put all that money in like a CD at what, 0.8% or some crazy thing. So that the hardest part about the transition from being in the company to selling is, I heard one of your other people say, like, you go from like playing to win to playing not to lose.
Yeah, James Ashford.
Yeah, I joked around that, like, I feel like I'm sitting on a giant sand castle, and it doesn't really matter how big it is because every wave that comes like takes some of it away. And when when you have a company, you're constantly like pushing more sand up onto it, and so it doesn't matter that it's big because you keep thinking like a big wave could come and just like take half of my stuff. So that part's very hard, to sort of wrap your head around that.
I've heard it's really hard to quote live off your capital. Like I've actually heard it for people who are builders like you. It can be very psychologically difficult for no rational reason, but just you're so used to it.
What's also weird is I did the same thing with the post stuff. Like, what am I going to do post? I try to meet with lots of CEOs who had sold. And like, who manages your money? Like, how do you think about it? How do you live off of financial assets, like financial capital versus human capital? And I tried to do a little bit of the pre-work. I mean, it was compressed because I was doing a lot of other stuff, but I couldn't believe how many wealthy people I met with that are like, I got a guy at Merrill. And it's like, what's the strategy? I don't know. I don't even know if he's doing that well. Like, I got to call him. And it's like, seriously? And I can't tell you how many people that I talk to that I would say, like, if I go back and change something, I spent no time learning about like personal finance, like investing, just none of that stuff. I didn't have a background in it. I think the thought was like, well, I won't sell until I have so much that it won't matter. And to some degree, that's sort of true. But like you're saying, psychologically, I've now tried to sort of set it up more like a family office, like treat it like it's a business. Like, what's our goal? What's the strategy? How do we monitor progress? What are the key metrics look like? What do I do when something's going wrong? Like, what's my process for sorting through it? I'm sure the finance guys I've already had them a couple of times say, like, we don't think about it that way. I'm like, well, if you want to do my stuff, you have to.
What was Bob's reaction when the deal closed?
Somewhere, extreme excitement.
I'd imagine.
He is living his best life. I mean, he's got a house now in Colorado and his place, in Maryland, and he was I think he played high school football. I don't think he played college football, but he's had like both knees replaced and his hip replaced, but he's like doing great. And but no, I think he's living his best life. And like I said, I knew he was excited to take some chips off the table way back during the first potential transaction, and then selling to some of us employees, and so yeah, I have to imagine that he was super excited. And those deals, it's obviously everyone listening to this, it's so hard when you're kind of like, it's like sort of engaged but not married, and like at any day your fiance could just say, I've changed my mind. Like, I'm going a different direction. You're not what I thought you were.
I know your time is short. Are you up for a quick lightning round before we
Yeah, sure. Go for it.
All right, real quick. What's the slimiest trick an acquirer tried to play on you in the process of selling your business?
I've only worked with or only had interactions with a couple, and the folks that we did the deal with were super above. They did every single thing they said they were going to do and better. And I stayed on a little while after the sale, and just 100%, like, we had a big software that we were replatforming. I thought for sure as soon as they acquire us, they're going to scrap the whole thing, because why? It's a big expense. They put more resources into it. The only thing I can think of that it's not a slimy trick, but we did have a group once that wanted us to do like a proof of concept, like sell to our clients, prove that it was a strategic kind of cross-sell situation. And, again, I mean, I don't know that it was nefarious, but it felt a little like, oh, then we like get hooked in, kind of like Bob's thing of like letting it build big enough that now you almost have to take whatever I offer you.
Yeah. Emotional high and low of selling.
I mean, I remember when the money hit my bank account, I went on this mountain bike loop that I would do right from my house. And I remember getting halfway through the loop, just like pausing, like pulling up my Schwab account or whatever it gotten wired to, and just looking at it and like screaming in the woods. Someone, if there are any houses nearby, probably like some guy just, got attacked by a coyote.
Like a mountain lion.
Yeah. So that was like the emotional high. The low, I will say it's weird. I've always been told that you want to be rich and anonymous. That's actually like the best. But it is weird when you're a CEO and your phone rings nonstop. Key employees, vendors, friends, and everyone wants to bend your ear on stuff. Get free restaurant, new restaurants opening. Bring your team here. When you're out, it's like all of a sudden it's just gone. No insurance sales guys calling anymore, but also no one like rolling out the red carpet. Unless you go out and make yourself visible.
Can you point our listeners to any resources that you found helpful as you prepared to sell? I know you talked about talking to other CEOs, so that was super helpful, it sounds like.
Yeah, I would have done more. I would have done more of that. Folks running companies that have gotten to a certain size, you start to sort of feel like, you have a team of people running the company, and there's actually like not much for you to do, which is amazing. But sometimes that CEO role, you sort of think like, what should I be doing? And like, you have to kind of like create the job, whatever will add the most value to the company. And like, again, I did some of this, but I should have done 10 times as much as I did, which is calling, other business owners, meeting investment bankers, talking to as many people as I can. I think what I see happening, I saw this happening with our clients, the home service companies, what would be, they would be like in an industry group, and a buddy of theirs would get acquired, and they would sort of just then all of a sudden be linked in with that, group, with that acquirer. And so I think that's a tricky one. There's one other thing that's happening in all spaces, which is, like Service Titan and, these kind of ERP, CRM systems. I mean, if you're on that platform, it's great because your data is automatically structured in a way that an acquirer can kind of make sense of it quickly. But those companies have an awful lot of your data, and they're impossible to get off of once you're on. So there's, I don't know, just ways that you might want to think about some of that stuff. If you're not on the platform, you just kind of zooming out and sort of thinking big picture about what you might want to do.
Yeah, well said. Last question. Trophy. What did you buy yourself to commemorate the win?
What's sad is I eventually bought a house, but I bought that more for my wife than for me. I got a house that adjoins a country club overlooking the golf course. I'm looking at it right now. It's amazing. But I had bought myself a trophy, the first time we almost sold. I always wanted a 911. It was like I had it like stuck in my office or something. And when the deal didn't go through that first time in 2013, 14, whatever it was, I went out in 2015 when I finally had some cash and bought, a nice car. And it was so funny because I didn't even feel like I could drive it because I was afraid one of our clients would see it and say like, this guy's like overcharging us. So, and I also realized the biggest irony that people probably, it's like this weird thing, which is once you can buy yourself anything you want, I got to that point, unfortunately, after I realized that none of that stuff creates any kind of like real happiness. It's like the ultimate, like, I can buy anything, and I know that buying any of that stuff does nothing for me. So anyway.
So what did you buy in 2015?
I bought a 911, Carrera 2S convertible, like a typical jackass, I didn't have much gray hair. And so, I like to think that I didn't look like, wasn't too crazy. But what was funny is I got it, my kids were little, and I would say to my kids like, hey, let's go for a ride. And everyone, my wife included, hated it. It was loud, my daughter's hair would fly over. Now that my daughter's like 14, she's like, why don't you buy another one? Like, my son's like, if you ever buy a car like that and pick me up at high school, I will kill you. I'll pretend I don't know you. So I think I've raised one of them at least.
Yeah, they sound like they're well adjusted. Yeah. I know I've overstayed my welcome, so thank you for doing this. Where can people reach out if they want to say hi on social? I think LinkedIn might be the best.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. They can always email me, either ben@benlanders.com, or I've set up a new entity yet to be determined what it does, but ben@aheadofnext.com, or just go to LinkedIn. And anyone who is facing a situation post sale, I'm generally an open book, happy to try to help and add value any way I can.
Well, you've done that today in spades, Ben. I really appreciate you sharing the story with such candor and humility. It was really good to get to know you, and congratulations on everything.
Thanks, John. Thanks for the time.